This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This is a non-commercial broadcast, so we've never asked viewers to subscribe or follow us. However, having subscribers, which is free, helps us to gain support from grant agencies and to continue this series. So if you like us, please tap or click the red subscribe button on YouTube on the lower right-hand side of your screen, or the follow button on your podcast. This talk is with David Kastan, George M. Bodman, Professor of English at Yale University. In Shakespeare studies, David is widely known for his keen critical insights into the relationships between literature and history in the early modern period. More recently, he is also known for his work in the visual arts and on color. He is currently working on two books, the first on Shakespeare and Rembrandt, and the second that will perhaps be called The Problem of Beauty. This talk is made possible with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Your interests are broad-based, indeed. You've made an enormous contribution to Shakespeare studies as a critic and as an editor. You've focused on the historical Shakespeare, on the histories of Shakespearean text, and on how we remember Shakespeare. And also, you've done exquisite work on Shakespeare and religion, and a bunch more stuff that I have to leave out, else our listeners will start hollering at me to shut up and let you talk. All right, this is one of two David Kastans I want to introduce. The first being the critic, the textual scholar, and the editor, there with print and page, a world of black and white, and with some gray perhaps for good measure. But the other, or the second David Kastan, is someone who is drawn to color and anything having to do with color, as your book On Color with Stephen Farthing so thoughtfully and joyfully illustrates. This interest in color also has much ado about art, which is also in the scope of your current interest, namely Shakespeare and Rembrandt. So let's start with the now. May we ask you to give us a preview of this project on these two monumental figures, and also on, the problem of beauty, which is another current project.
Well, I thank you for the gracious introduction and the, to me, almost recognizable sense of a long, enjoyable career. I'm not sure who else enjoyed it, but I've enjoyed every second of it. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk with you and meet you too. I like most of the ththings that happened to me, this last part of this career is mostly accidental. Maybe I can tell the story slightly backwards. I went to college. I was an undergraduate at Princeton. I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. I didn't have much idea what I was supposed to do there, or if I could do whatever it was I was supposed to do there. This was really very new for me. And I started by looking at the old course catalog when there were such things that weren't online. And I started at the A's and rather quickly got to art. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really wonderful. They have these classes in painting, and maybe I won't have to write papers, which was the thing I was most terrified of. So one of my first semester classes was a sort of introduction to painting. And it turned out my teacher, I didn't know it then, it was a rather distinguished American painter, a kind of very successful, very impressive, sort of a second-tier abstract expressionist, not Jackson Pollock, but very, very good. And he was very nice to me, and I assumed that was because I had at least some minimal talent. And one day he came over to me and said, David, can we get a cup of coffee after class? And I thought, well, certainly, this is wonderful. And then I thought, well, maybe he's going to tell me I have so much talent, I should perhaps just move to Paris and drop out of college. And then I was thinking, well, how could I tell my parents? They were so proud of me going to college, and this was costing money. And I was already having this conversation, jumping a gun too far. And we go off to have coffee, and his name was Esteban Vicente. And Esteban puts his hand on mine and he says, David, I don't think you should be doing this. Which was exactly right. And I wanted to cry. And so I thought about it. And he said, you're welcome to stay in the class, but if I were you, I would look for something else. So in fact, I started with art and color, then took what was the detour into literature, which I found out I had at least minimal skills, acceptable skills to my professors. So it all could have been so very, very different had I been a little bit better. But I always had these two interests. And as an undergraduate, I probably had enough art history courses to major in that. Had I chosen to, when I was applying to graduate schools, I applied to some art history programs as well as English programs. I even applied to 2 law schools because I had so little idea what I really wanted to do. And then decided, partly because there was a young faculty member I used to drink with. That's the true part of the story. We would go drinking together and he would give me advice, and he taught me various useful things, like one of the few recipes I actually know how to cook. Al taught me. And he just said, if I were you, I'd get out of the East, get out of the Ivy League, go to the University of Chicago. I know some people there. I think they're really wonderful. I think you'll enjoy it. And if you don't, you could come somewhere else. People would happily let you come back. So I went to the University of Chicago thinking I was going to work on modern poetry. I mean, this long shaggy dog story just tells you how everything accidental was. I took my first course on modern poetry. I had written my undergraduate thesis on a 20th century Scottish poet named Edwin Muir, who I think a wonderful poet, but not very well. And I had this crazy idea, which actually today would be a good idea, then seemed insane, which was, what if you talked about British poetry from the point of view of the periphery of Scotland and Wales and Ireland? And I sort of invented some idea for a possible dissertation where I would write about Muir and Dylan Thomas and Yeats, and what their relationship was to the center, which was always going to be London in a way. And I had this initial meeting with the professor, our first week of my time in graduate school. And the professor kind of just looked at me and said, why would you want to do that? And I thought, oh dear, that is what I want to do. And I actually thought about leaving graduate school. I called one of the law schools I was admitted to, and I said, I think I've made a terrible mistake. Would it be possible to sort of reactivate my application or abjure my declining of the offer? And I didn't realize I was talking to a secretary. I didn't have any idea who I was speaking with. And she said very sweetly, she said, well, I'm sure if you got in last time, you'd get in again. So, I can just activate your file for you. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. And then I said, well, could I come in January? And she just said, of course not. I mean, you'd have to sort of go through the application process again. And it probably would be fine, but you could come in September. So I thought, oh, well, can't go now. So what will I do? I'll stay in school. I like reading books. I like drinking beer. I like talking to my new friends. So this will be fine. But I didn't find something I loved. And then I was taking the bus to the airport at the end of the first semester, in Chicago. And I was sitting next to someone who recognized me just from the library or something. He said, oh, aren't you in the English program? And I said, yes. And he said, how was it? And I said, oh, it was fine. And then I said, how was your term? He said, oh, it was great. I took the Shakespeare course from David Bevington, and it was magnificent. So I said, oh, I'd never heard of him. I had vaguely heard of Shakespeare. So the next quarter, I took a Shakespeare course, and I said something on the first day of class. He asked a bunch of questions. And after class, he said to me, well, Mr. Kastan, could I see you for a moment after class? Well, my experience with professors wanting to speak to me was really not very good. So I was quite nervous, wondering what had I done now to be asked to leave this program. And he said, oh, that was sort of interesting what you said. I'm just curious, where did that idea come from? And I said, oh, well, it's not my idea. I had taken a seminar when I was an undergraduate, and it was one of the teacher's ideas that I learned from him. And he sort of smiled. He said, who is that? And I said, Paul Gray. And he said, oh, Paul was one of my students. So what had happened was he had heard his idea coming full circle. And sort of that, but he was amused by that and was very kind to me. And he was a wonderful, wonderful teacher.
Yeah.
And so the Shakespeare part was really an accident. You know, had I been a better painter, I think I would have tried to do that. If that hadn't kind of cost me some confidence, I might have gone to graduate school in art history. And I sort of feel that it's all just come full circle.
Yeah.
And to answer the question you actually asked, which is how
That's
did I get?
okay. This is wonderful, Dave. David, the idea that we go back, we're both old enough to go back and think just how, it is a Robert Frost moment there, how different, how differently things could have turned out
Yeah,
over something that maybe happened over a period of 24 hours or maybe just in a moment of decision. But yeah, I'll let you go ahead here.
well, and but that's absolutely right. I mean, I've talked to so many people and I've done these kinds of talks with people, and I'm always so grateful anybody cares what I've experienced and thought. Um, but people, always say, well, were you interested in Shakespeare as a child? Well, the answer was no. I mean, my family wasn't particularly literary. Uh, my father, who worked on tobacco field and then moved into sales at one point, they were Depression kids and didn't go to university. He was actually a quite talented amateur artist. He was a good photographer. He was a very good watercolorist. He made beautiful ceramics. I could probably show you some bowls of his if I wanted to move the Zoom screen around. So I had a visual experience that was richer than any literary experience I had. And I always imagine these alternative words, but they all were total accidents. I mean, every bit of it was an accident. And sometimes I think, well, if I'd done what I planned to do, how much worse might it have been? This has been a wonderful life, I feel very lucky to it. And then to get to your question, which really was about Shakespeare and Rembrandt. So let me say two things about what in retrospect looks like a career. In the moment, always seem like a bunch of sort of arbitrary, partly foolish thoughts. Shakespeare and Rembrandt. I think I fell in love with Rembrandt before I fell in love with Shakespeare. The Shakespeare love came much, much later. I did take one undergraduate Shakespeare course at Princeton, and it was taught by a frustrated actor who actually was a kind of dreadful teacher. I mean, he didn't teach us anything, but he'd perform, and usually with his hand clenched in some fist and the voice becoming portentous. And, it was so far from my unsophisticated sense of what school was like. It didn't much interest me. I sort of liked reading it, but it was very difficult for me. The language was hard, the syntax was hard. I didn't come from a background of it. And I could write, which is also an accident. I had a very good English teacher in high school. So I actually could write reasonable prose, which quickly set me apart from 90% of my other classmates who were much better educated and probably much cleverer than I was. But I did like Rembrandt. There was something about I couldn't explain why I liked it. I didn't take a course, but there was something about going to a museum. I would sort of gravitate to the Dutch art. I do remember my first trip to London, which was after I was I was already teaching at Dartmouth, my first job, and I had some summer money they gave me to do research for my book. And I went and I went to Kenwood House, and there's a late portrait of Rembrandt, the sort of an unfinished portrait with two circles in the back of it, or arcs in the back, seemed like they would have been circles if they had extended. And I just fell in love with that painting, and I lived about I had rented a room, maybe a 5-minute walk from Kenwood House. And I went day after day for about 2 weeks. And I just stand in front and trying to figure out what was it that drew me to it. And I think there have been two ideas, and I've only had two ideas in my life, as far as I can say, famous distinction between hedgehogs and foxes. And I always wanted to be a fox, but I realized I'm really a hedgehog. And it was disappointing to discover that. So, the one idea that I could articulate was always sort of about culture and history, and what allows it to survive and how implausible those survivals are. So I sort of had stumbled into an idea I couldn't articulate about appropriation and something of that sort. But that is the constant in everything. And then kind of related to that constant was a particular thought, which how is it that, at least in the West, Shakespeare and Rembrandt can more or less stand in for the whole effort to understand our common humanity. And that seemed so utterly implausible to me, because I just knew partly my own experience was how uncommon, how disparate, even of people, more or less, white people, well-educated people, upper or middle-class people. And how could that even happen? So all of the work has always been part of kind of this two sets of ideas. I mean, my sense about culture is all culture is appropriative, which makes me uncomfortable with some of the discomfort with appropriation that seems reflexive and underthought. I mean, what is culture except, what was the great classical cultures except appropriations of everything around them? And then what is the Renaissance but a radical appropriation of classical culture? So those ideas dominated everything. And so Shakespeare and Rembrandt, I think what happened was I love working on Shakespeare. I still write about Shakespeare. I'm still involved in various projects. But I realized I was free to do other things, right? I had wonderful jobs. I had a sort of magical career, which was unimaginable for me in almost every state. I mean, I only taught at three universities. I taught at Dartmouth, Columbia, and Yale. Yeah. Fabulous students. And I just feel it was magic. And I love doing it. I love teaching. I could do it forever. And then I thought, I don't want anything more from the profession. There's nothing more it could give me. There'd be nothing good about it giving me any more to gratify my narcissism than it already has. And I thought, I have the options now of doing slightly different things, which if you were a young scholar coming up for tenure, you couldn't take the risk of writing on color or writing on Shakespeare and Rembrandt or writing a book about beauty. But I felt that's the one thing I had. A lot of growing old is not so interesting to me, but that is a sort of pleasure which thrills me. And so I thought I didn't really want to write another Shakespeare book. I thought I had sort of said most of the things that I wanted to say. And there still were articles I wanted to and continue to and will continue to write, but I didn't think I had another big book. And the books, people, fortunate enough that publishers will sometimes come to me and say, do you want to do something? But the books they were suggesting, and I think because they thought they'd have a kind of trade possibility of popular sales, they say, well, why don't you write a book? You've been working on Shakespeare for, why don't you write a book about, all of your ideas about Shakespeare's plays? And there are wonderful books like that, Marge Garber's book, and there are terrific examples of that. I thought, one, I don't want to do that. I mean, it doesn't interest me. For me, lecturing has always been part of just that engagement with that classroom. And once it turned into something else, when it turned into my prose and those faces weren't visible to me, and you couldn't see anymore when they were bored or where they were delighted, or, I just thought that's not how I'm motivated. And I thought it just wasn't a book and there were better books of that sort. that I can think of. Tony Tanner's written a good one, Marge, of course, Maurice Charney. I mean, there are a whole bunch of them, some of which are better than others. But it's not something that interests me. And I thought this problem, which had been kind of latent in my head, which was, well, how does Shakespeare and Rembrandt become Shakespeare and Rembrandt? I mean, that was sort of what I was thinking about. And I thought, oh, well, I've always wanted to. I'd been writing a little bit, as you mentioned before, about painting. I had been doing for about a decade kind of museum catalog essays for various painters, gallery, short 3,000 word things. And some publisher would say, well, we can pay you some small amount of money. And I would say, oh, I don't want any money. What I'd really love would be a drawing by the artist. And that guy said, oh, that's great. That doesn't cost anybody any money. So I started to collect some of those. So I've been thinking about how to write about art and thinking about how different writing about art is than writing about literature, and sort of, philosophical questions about, like, literature stops, literature ends, a piece of art doesn't. What does that mean for how we think about it and talk about? There are edges, but not endings, say in a painting. And that's why I thought, well, I'll try to do that. I didn't have a plan. I really thought that I was going to write a book just about Rembrandt, and I did. I wrote about 95,000 words in a book about Rembrandt. And my editor, I got a too enthusiastic advance for a book I thought would never sell what they were paying me for. And I said to my editor, I don't want to do this. And she said, I really like the book. I think it's going to be wonderful. And they were going to do it with like 72 images, and it would color. It'd be really a beautiful book. And I said, well, here's the problem. Supposing it is pretty good, and say the New York Times wants to review it, who are they going to give it to review? Well, they're going to give it to a Rembrandt scholar. And what can a Rembrandt scholar say about my book, a Shakespeare scholar? And the only thing it seemed to me that Rembrandt scholar could say would be one of two things. Either, well, it's very nice, but everybody knows this, or it's okay, but it's kind of crazy. I mean, those seem to be the only thing. And I thought, what might have been my last book, I didn't want that to be the response. So I said, I'd rather not do that. And she said, well, you don't really care. I mean, you don't care what Rembrandt scholars say. And I said, well, that's not true. I do care, and I am a scholar, and I've always felt that one of the responsibilities is you need to position yourself in that world and say things that are credible and interesting and move the discussion on in some direction. And if I can't do that, I think actually I should have thought of this earlier, but I didn't. And she said, well, what would you want to do? I really would like a book from you. And I was put on the spot. And I said, well, I'll do a book on Shakespeare and Rembrandt. At least with the Shakespeare, I have credibility. And so puts the Rembrandt scholar, even if that's who reviews the book, wrong foots him just a little bit. And maybe that gives me some edge. And she said, well, what would that look like? And I said, I don't know. I don't. And it took me probably 8 months of trying to figure out what that book looked like, because I didn't want to do compare and contrast. And so at the moment, the first line of the book is, it is the and that is the problem. It's called Shakespeare and Rembrandt. It is the and that is the problem. Say, what does that actually, what relationship are you imagining here? And you could say a bunch of relatively inconsequential things about them. They're both incredibly successful, incredibly important. They're pros. They work in multiple genres. They always were doing it for money, aware of viewers and audiences in this way. But they didn't know each other. They didn't speak the same language, even though they lived about 200 miles apart. They had no knowledge of one another. So there was some stretch here, and I didn't want to do compare and contrast. Rembrandt does paintings of old people. Shakespeare has plays about old people. I didn't think there was anything interesting you could do with that either wasn't just arbitrary or banal or obvious. And it took me about 8 months to come up with a structure that I'm not sure it works. In fact, if you'll do it, I'll send you a chapter and you can tell me if you think it works.
Would love it.
And
I would love to read it.
and the epigraph to the whole book is a line from a 20th century novelist I like a lot, Elizabeth Hardwick, who also wrote a lot of reviews and was very involved with New York Review of Books when that was all started. And Hardwick says somewhere, she says something, nothing grows in the arid soil of mere comparison. So the title, the first line is, it's the end, that's the problem. But the epigraph above it is, nothing grows in the arid soil of mere comparison.
Yeah.
And so how could you talk about them that wasn't mere comparison? And what kinds of relationships could you set up? And for me, it's seeing the two of them as kind of force fields in some, like kind of magnetic forces that either attract or repel in some way. And so the structure of each chapter it's tripartite. It starts, there are 3 sections to every chapter and a kind of coda to each, which is very personal. But it starts with an account of a Rembrandt image or painting. Then there's a second section about something about Shakespeare that in some cases is sort of obvious. Say there's a chapter on the 2 great Rembrandt paintings of Lucretia. That both in the US, one in Minneapolis, one in Washington, D.C. And they're magnificent, both. One 2 seconds before Lucretia stabs herself and 1 second after she has. And then I thought I would write about Shakespeare's Lucrece. But I talk about the first painting, I stop, just there are 4 dots. And then I talk about Shakespeare's Lucrece, I stop, and then I talk about the Minneapolis Lucretia. And so the reader gets to sort of put this conversation together. And I now have about half of that new book done. And I think 3 of the 4 chapters really work. I'm not sure about the 4th chapter yet. And I kind of work at it obsessively every day to keep that tension going, not making it too obvious, not making it too opaque, making that connection fun for a reader and exciting, and that somehow whatever these chapters are about, one of the ones I think does work is Shakespeare's sonnets and Rembrandt's self-portraits, both of which turn in, for a lot of critics, into forms of autobiography. And I think neither are forms of autobiography. I think they're forms of very self-conscious display. Look what I can do, more than trying to tell some truth about their lives. And that chapter really rejects this idea of this is autobiographical. And partly because they wouldn't be better if they were autobiographical, number one. But there's also no particular evidence that they are. That's a lot of projection and guesswork and desire. And so that's the way the book works. I think it's going to be fun. I'm excited about it. I've been able to use less of the 95,000 words I had written about Rembrandt before than I thought, but occasionally a sentence finds its way into the new book, or a paragraph finds its way into a new book. And then it's turned out that as I've gone through it, I now can see better what that and is, what they do have in common. And some of it is kind of wonderful, strange bits of history that interest me. For instance, right after the Dutch revolt, when the northern provinces break free of the southern provinces, but of the Spanish Habsburg Catholic Empire, they wanted to be independent from Spain, but they didn't really want to be an independent nation. And they offered, which I knew, but I'd sort of never put this all together. They offered Elizabeth the opportunity to be the sovereign in 1579 and again in 1585. And she says no. So there's a counter history. So I have one of the things that I said before, that every chapter ends with a little coda at the end. So there's an introduction that has says, well, they have nothing to do with each other. And then there's the coda says, but they could have. There's a counter history where they could have been part of the same history. And then the deep structure underneath is, so what is it that these guys can do that has allowed them to play this extraordinary role? And and so part of it is a remarkable trick that they do. They just invite us. I mean, and it is a trick of skill.
Mhm.
Wittgenstein has a great line where he says, genius is the word we use so we can forget skill. And I think that's just, so they're geniuses, but exactly in that sense, not in the mystifying Harold Bloom sense. So that's how I got there. That's what it'll be. I'm thrilled about it. I said to my wife the other day, I feel so, and the only word I can think of was grateful, at a moment when the world seems so broken in so many ways and there's so little will to try to fix it.
Yeah.
I I
Yeah.
wake up every morning, I make a pot of coffee, and I go to work writing a book about the two artists I love the most, and it is a love letter. I mean, that's what it is. It's a love letter.
Yeah. Yeah. What an exquisite privilege. I think that what in my memory, both of Shakespeare and Rembrandt is when I first got to London, coming off of a farm. I grew up out in the country, tobacco, all of that, and there just weren't the world-class art museums. The first one I would have been able to go to would be, of course, the National Gallery in Washington. The Frick was another planet. So I find myself in London on a kind of foreign study program. And there you have the two things, right? You have the National Gallery, you have the National Portrait Gallery, which I just love. I think
I
it's
love it.
closed right now, but I just love that place for it's just endlessly fascinating. And then, of course, the West End theater scene and theater all over, underground theater, just all these things. But I do remember knowing nothing about art, that, you have all of these rooms in the National Gallery in either Washington or London. And you go into the 17th century, the early 17th century room, and you just stop. You just stop right there. You go, okay, I can't see the whole thing, but I'm going to take time right here. And in some ways, it is the least colorful. If
Yeah.
you think about the other things out there, the Italian art and so forth. But but then in some ways it is the most with of course, famously the use of light and so forth. It just seems it's technique, of course, but it just seems genius. And that's all of those guys,
Totally
Vermeer,
agree.
El Greco, but Rembrandt and the self-portraits, you're going, yeah, I agree with you. Something else is going on there.
Yeah,
Uh,
they're really
and
quite amazing. So the little coda, you'll enjoy this because you would do it. To the chapter on sonnets and the self-portraits, I went over. I mean, one of the lovely things about doing this project is you can justify going to London and Amsterdam. It's tax deductible. It's a beautiful thing. So I went over I wanted to see the Vermeer show.
yeah.
Well, I went to see that last March, and the Vermeer show was crowded, but it turned out the other side of the Rijksmuseum was pretty empty. I mean, everybody went to the Vermeer show. And so I would go spend 2 or 3 hours each day at the Vermeer show. I'd gotten tickets in advance. And then I'd just cross that little walkway and go look at the Rembrandts. And there's an early Rembrandt self-portrait uh, that it's very small. It's about 9 inches by 7 inches.
Mhm.
And it glows. I mean, you walk in that room, and here's the smallest painting on the wall. And as you say, the colors are muted, but saturated, but just rich and rich with change.
Mhm.
And I love looking at the iris of an eye in a Rembrandt painting. That should be a color that some lipstick maker could make. Just it's so rich in color, the range of it, and from white to black. And but muted the effect. So I'm looking at this painting, and it's like a tropism. I walk in the room and it just drew me to it. And one day I was there, and there was this, and when I heard them speak, I realized they were English. It was a mother with maybe a 10-year-old daughter who just looked like the perfect English countryside daughter, blonde hair and pink cheeks and adorable and a cute smile and a wonderful accent. And really well educated and clever and knew it. There was a little bit of that in her kind of poise I suspect you and I never had as children. Uh, and she says, "Oh, Mummy, is that Rembrandt?" Pointing at the picture. And her mother, who you could sort of the look on her face was, "I've had a little bit too much of this in the last few hours." And she goes, "No, darling, he's dead." Which I just thought was so funny. So that's the little coda to that story. Is that Rembrandt? No, he's dead. Um, but you used a word before that really struck me. I wrote it down. You said you had to just stop, and stop was your word. And the other thing you mentioned in the introduction, the gracious introduction, was this other weird book on the problem of beauty, which
Mhm.
that's the answer to that book. I mean, I kept thinking, what the last class I taught at Yale, it was during COVID, everything was online, was a class I just decided to teach called On the Problem of Beauty. And wasn't anything I taught before or something I kind of thought about before. What is beauty? And you realize that most of the people who talk about beauty have sort of instrumental. I mean, one version of the argument is it's instrumental. That is, it's a kind of Darwinian argument that birds have beautiful plumage because you attract uh, a better mate, and it's sort of all some strange argument about the usefulness in the world. That can't explain artistic beauty exactly. And then there's another argument which starts with Plato and carries on, which is, it's not that it's instrumental, but it's kind of metaphoric, that beauty is what stands in for the good or the just. And that isn't quite, I mean, doesn't seem to be quite right either. And so I kept thinking, well, what is it? And it seems to be what it is. It's that quality of the world or of something made that makes you stop. It's about attention. It's the thing that commands your attention. And I think about how many sunsets have we all seen? And they're lovely, but every once in a while there's one and you stop. You just stop, or you go into a museum and you're looking at wonderful paintings and you walk. But one of the things, I don't know if this will be in the book or not, but at some point I want to write about this. I want an essay which is how we look. Because what really struck me, especially on this trip to see the Vermeer show, because it was very crowded, and partly because I love just standing in front of paintings and just taking them in, and you really couldn't. And the thing I noticed, and on my phone, I have hundreds and hundreds of pictures of people in front of paintings with their phones. And what they do is they wait in line, get to the front of the line, get to the painting, reach for their phone, take a picture, and move on. And you go like, why did you come? why would you come? And, in a way, it's a wonderful kind of mnemonic to keep it. You can go back and look and say, oh yeah, but all the things that are kind of amazing about the painting, you can't see. You can't see that play of color in the iris of an eye. You can't see what's in the margins, the edges of those paintings. You can't see the textural changes that give a Rembrandt painting that gives it depth, and then the light refracts differently. So why would you do this? I mean, and so in front of that very painting where the little girl the next day asked him, is that Rembrandt? There were people in front of that, and I kind of get to that painting. And then the gentleman behind me, who turned out to be an American, says, oh, I don't mean to be rude, but are you going to stay there for a long time? And I said, well, I've been here about 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, I'd love to stay for another minute, but if you're in a hurry, I'll happily, just change places with you. And he said this not to be a wise guy, just trying to help me out. He said, you have a phone and you could just take a picture of it.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, like, oh dear. So your experience of going to one of these museums, and I, like you, I do love that National Portrait Gallery, and just being able to indulge yourself, however much time it takes. And yet we went to Paris over New Year's, and partly to see Rembrandt. So one of the little tasks I've set myself for the book is I will not write about a painting I have not seen in person. Though in fact on a computer you can often do amazing things by blowing up details and things, but it just seems like a bad idea. So we went, and there was a couple of paintings in the Louvre we wanted to see, and there were a couple of big shows, and there was kind of nobody there. We were in a room with 16 Rembrandts, and I'd say we were there for maybe an hour and a half, maybe more. And I say maybe 15 people in the whole time came through, and nobody spent more than 4 or 5 minutes in that room. Not even that. Look at the painting in maybe 30 seconds and go. And then Jane and I, my wife, we started to just watch people look at paintings. And we sort of think, if they spent 30 seconds, that was a lot. Nobody spent 3 minutes, and that's not enough, right? I mean, I'm always amazed when we look at.
That's why the benches are in the room.
Yeah, right.
Just to sit down, I remember, well, I'm sure that people do it now. Of course, art students do, and so forth, but they put benches there. You sit down and you can take in things that way. So
it's amazing, and it bothers me. I mean, you have this incredible gift of these museums. I mean, you meant the Frick. I live in New York now, and so the Frick is remarkable. And one of the best things I ever did as a parent, the thing, on Judgment Day, when the only thing that might get me into heaven that I've ever done is the Frick had as a rule that you children under 10 may not go. And on my daughter Marina's 10th birthday, I took her out of school and said, we're going to the Frick because you are now 10. And we did. I thought that was a commitment. And starting with that, we played a game all through her until she left home as going to go to college. We'd go to museums, and the game was, okay, you can only have one of these. And so she had to think, okay, if I can only own one of these, which she knew she couldn't, but if you were going to pretend you can own, what would it be? And it was so interesting to watch her just make decisions on a whole series. What was too big to fit into her room, assuming she could get it out of the museum undetected. What color scheme, but mostly is what did she fall in love with? And I think she now works at the Met as she's a textile conservator, but she will say, it was my 10th birthday present going to the Frick that just made me think that museums are these magical worlds that I want to live in. And you think, okay, my one parenting success. I'm not sure I had any others.
Well, just the notion when you bring it up, and I'm thinking, okay, David's going to have an angle on this beauty thing, and of course, the standard lines just come to my head: terrible beauty, the Yeats, and fearful symmetry, and she walks in beauty. And I then kind of, I guess we do this as sort of humanities nerds or whatnot. But not that long ago, I was at the Prado and I was interested in Raphael and connections between Raphael and maybe Milton, or which is one of your people, and Shakespeare. And I got bored. Maybe I'm becoming, I don't know, as I got older. There are just so many images of the crucified Christ in there. And so just exquisite, beautiful, all of that. And there was a special exhibit of Goya. And I said, oh, let's go over there. And there's nothing more unbeautiful about there's nothing more. And again, uh, you go, what is this? I mean, you go in for Raphael and you leave with Goya, right?
Yeah, which is right,
Yeah.
which means you have a great eye.
Uh,
No, I think that's right. And I've spent a lot of time with those Goyas at the Prado too, which are nothing I ever thought about writing about. But I do think your point is really an interesting one. And one of the things I think about beauty is beauty and ugliness are not properly opposites. I mean, I think it's avoiding something that is crucial, which is why I sort of came back to this idea of that beauty is the thing that stops you, that, that insists on your attention. I find increasingly as I get older and realize, one, how difficult attention is, but also worry about the young and their inability to attend. My son, who is wonderful and kind and smart and makes brilliant, wonderful documentary films about things that matter in the world.
mhm.
But he has an attention. I mean, in a way, film is perfect for him because the unit is really the frame. uh, he's, I, I always claim he's never read a book. He never quite will admit that to me. His great line was when he was in high school, he was taking a American literature course. And it was at the end of the term. I knew he hadn't read a book that year at all. It was senior year, so I got a pass maybe. And I said, do me one favor. I know one of the things that's assigned to you is Leaves of Grass.
Mhm.
And it's amazing. It does seem to me in so many ways the kind of quintessential American book of its own modernity. And he's a wonderful kid. And he says, oh, sure, Dad. And he goes in his room and he comes out 3 hours later, and I feel another victory. It's my victory with Alex over that will match my victory with Marina. And I said, oh, did you read Leaves of Grass? And he says, nah, I read Leaf of Grass. I read a poem and then I played video games. And that's my boy. But that worries me, that the ability to attend. And I think, one of the things about a class that goes well, you teach, and when students suddenly understand what they're trying to attend to and that they can do that,
Uh-huh.
they learn to see what's wonderful about this, how it's put together, and it is empowering for them instead of just exhausting or infuriating, frustrating to them. And I do think I mean, you're a wonderful interlocutor. I mean, everything you say is so useful and smart. But that the terrible beauty, which I think is partly why the easy way of thinking of beauty and ugliness as opposites gets wrong. But there's wonderful Toni Morrison book, The Bluest Eye,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which is one version of the terrible beauty, the damage that certain ideals of beauty have done to people. I mean, the politics of certain of ideals of beauty is so much part of that complicated story and part of the problem that's there that needs to be unpacked in some way. And instrumental or sentimental just doesn't do it. I mean, there's something much weirder about what grabs you. And and it's not always predictable. I mean, even for yourself.
Yeah.
I'm sometimes amazed of, going to a show of an artist I don't know and a quick look and thinking, yeah, this is fine. Good for him. And then going after about 25 minutes going like, oh my God, this is amazing. And can you make yourself stop? Can it make you stop?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
some.
Yeah, well, there's several thoughts that have come up. Of course, the idea of something that is incredibly horrible, ugly, the ugliest thing you can imagine, being one of those stopping points. And is there, of course, is beauty intrinsic to that? And also attention deficit. I guess Whitman was a kind of original attention deficit poet. He's all over the place, and was a joy of reading him is that he just brings these words out of nowhere and just throws them in. Uh, and I'm
That's why I thought my son might like it.
Yeah.
Maybe feel a kindred.
And I've heard the American writer Stephen Crane. I forget the name of the critic, but he talks about Crane's. He uses colors in his titles, the Blue Hotel and so forth. He called it prose pointillism.
Yeah.
And I was thinking there may be some connection there between writers and painters. That. So I guess I'm thinking about several things that I'm getting a little on the attention deficit side too, but there's some relationship here about the points at which literature intersect with art, and also in which ugliness intersects with beauty, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the literature and art intersection does interest me a lot. And I think literary critics we have a word for it, right? Ekphrasis. And I that was one of the things I actually really enjoyed thinking it through in a way in the Shakespeare Rembrandt chapter, because the Lucrece section, because you have that long ekphrasis where Lucrece raped and miserable and betrayed and abandoned, and that the only thing she can do, she goes to look at a painting,
Mm-hmm.
and there's that long, it's actually longer than Ovid in the Fasti has an account of Lucrece. It's longer than Ovid's whole account of the Lucretia story. But all that account of this painting, which Shakespeare almost certainly just made up. It's not a painting he actually saw,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the fall of Troy. And one of the things that's always struck me is even that language we use, that easy language of saying, that stopping. One of the words we use for that is, well, that painting speaks to me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the metaphors for
Yeah.
that. And you go, well, the one thing that painting doesn't do is speak to you. I mean, paintings are mute by definition. And one of the interesting things about that Shakespeare poem is how well Shakespeare understands that fact.
Yeah.
She is endlessly speaking, she's not listening to the painting, she's speaking for the painting. And you think that the thing about paintings is they don't say anything, which is precisely why we have so much to say about them. I think they do solicit this response in their muteness. I mean, often infuriating muteness, but it's one of the very good things about it.
Well, I think one of the differences that we might think of in Shakespeare is momentum, the metered verse. That's the art, that's the genius, if you call it that, the technique. Whereas in Rembrandt, of course, the use of light and everything else he does. But the um, the Keats reaction to the urn, the famous poem is silence and slow time, silence and slow time. I guess that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
There's a point of intersection there
No,
where
yeah,
if you don't stop, you slow down.
yeah. No, I think that's right. And I do think, one of the things we would say about the modern world. We had friends of ours, husband's a painter and the wife is a museum director, and they actually just got back from Japan. And we had dinner with them Saturday night, and they were showing us pictures they had taken, and they'd spent time in Kyoto and in Tokyo, and then went to the art islands, and had just this wonderful, wonderful trip. And one of the things that she tried to capture in her photographs, and he did a bunch of sketches, was how much those are places, Shinto temples and things, designed to slow you down, spaces. And yet, and so one of the things they talked about and tried to capture, I mean, they're both so very artistic in some of their photographs and the way they arranged their album, was Tokyo seems so sped up for them. I'm not just fast, but sped up. And then Kyoto, the sense of slow down, and nowhere, they said, did they ever actually feel that time unfolded in any of the rhythms that they actually were used to experience. I thought that was very interesting. And we've never been to Japan, though we've gone to China several times, and I'm going back this fall. But then we thought, after talking with them, we actually, all the things they showed us seemed to us, and obviously such a remarkable culture in so many ways, but seemed to me exactly the kinds of things I like to think about, you like to think about.
Oh, well, please come over in the fall. Please do find a way to do it. The yen is very cheap. The dollar is very strong. Much
That's right. It's a good moment. This is
to
the moment
spare.
that
I get paid in yen, but yes, it's a good time. Well, David, this is just endless stuff. We've gone from stopping to slowing down, and to all right, and applying that to art rather than to the momentum of prose and poetry. And yeah, I can't let you go without talking a little bit about your career as a Shakespearean. And one of my, which child is your favorite or whatnot, but which of your books is my favorite? Well, I guess the most recent one is because I've been working on religion a lot. And if you don't mind, I would like to shift a little bit. I was talking recently with Stephen Wittick, a younger scholar at Carnegie Mellon, and he was involved with the conversions project at McGill. And he said he'd gotten a chance to meet you there, but I just finished looking again at your book on religion. And I wanted, while I had you here, I wanted to thank you so much for not getting just sucked into this whole notion, which bores me. You talk about the new boredom on your webpage, as
that's the old boredom.
the new criticism, the new historicism. Now it's the new boredom. That stuff, unfortunately for my students, does not bore me.
Yeah.
What does bore me is trying to figure out what religion Shakespeare worship. When we all know that here we are in the middle of this century of conversion. We all know people who have converted to Christianity. We know people who have abandoned the faith, or all of these things. How would you ascribe a certain religion to this writer who is mostly speaking to us through characters, right? And that comes up time and again in your book on Shakespeare and religion.
I mean, that was a book, another one of the happy accidents of my life. I mean, I wasn't planning to write that, but at one point, Oxford University decided that they really needed to do something to honor Stanley Wells. And they said, in spite of the fact that they have many endowed lectureships, there was not one that was specific to Shakespeare. And they thought, well, we could do two things at once that make sense. So I was a great honor. I was the inaugural Oxford Wells lecturer. Yeah. And they said, we'd love for you to come do this. And, there are various advantages to it. We'll pay all your expenses to come over, and, Oxford University Press will publish the lectures. So that would be great. And you can talk about anything you want. So that point, I was sort of in the middle of the Arden Shakespeare editorial project. And I thought, oh, well, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is what might one say about editing Shakespeare at this moment in time, where, in the 1950s, Fredson Bowers writes, does editing Shakespeare, and McCarrow does an editing Shakespeare. And it's like every 30 years or so, somebody did, what would it mean to interestingly and appropriately edit Shakespeare? So I said, I would love to give the 4 lectures on editing Shakespeare in the year 2000 or whatever year that was. And there was silence on the other end of the phone. And then finally, a very plummy English accent said something like, well, that's a wonderful idea. And I'm sure you would give brilliant lectures on it. But we were actually hoping for something that might have a little more range of interest for a broader audience. And I said, oh, that's fine. How about religion? So it just was a off the cuff thing. But I'd been thinking about religion a lot over time in different contexts. And I'd written about Bible translation, and I'd written on John Fox, and a whole bunch of occasional essays that nobody has ever looked at again. My very first publication, which was written longhand in the Old British Museum, is on a metrical psalm that had been attributed to the then Princess Elizabeth, but I knew was actually written by John Bale. So my publishing history is about early modern religion and literature. So I thought that would be fun. And like you, I thought the boring question and the unanswerable question was, what religion is Shakespeare? The interesting question is, what role does religion play in a culture that Shakespeare knows is both sutured by and ruptured by religion? And that really is what the book is about. That book was important to me for a lot of reasons, but one, it was the first time I had tried to write for an audience slightly broader than the usual audience of Shakespeare scholars, people like you. I mean, where you could assume so much. How could you both manage more narrative without getting boring, more context, but show what's really interesting about what Shakespeare is doing? And I loved writing that. I had an enormous amount of fun giving those lectures. One of the Oxford colleges had it was in November of whatever year that was, and they organized an American style Thanksgiving for us, with us sitting at high table. It was an amazing, amazing experience. But I do think what happened is, at the moment where cultural historians who are interested in literature and religion start to think hard about early modern literature, and there suddenly was, correctly, a kind of emphasis on, I guess, what the religious historians call confessionalism.
Yes.
Particular forms of faith that were available.
Yeah.
And then the old question of, could Shakespeare be a Catholic, started to dominate one group, mainly by, I thought that was interesting. All the people who argue that Shakespeare was a Catholic, all are Catholic, which might just make them more sensitive to the issue, but also one might imagine a kind of special pleading. We want him on our side. And there's not enough evidence. And as you say, with Shakespeare, we know a lot of things, but almost none of the things we want to know. We don't know really anything about his own faith. There's no diary, there are no letters. There's one letter written to him, and that's asking for a loan. And yet, this is somebody who understands that even at the most ordinary level of language, religion is written into the culture. Goodbye, God be with you. There's the old Chesterton joke, God bless you, said the atheist after the minister sneezed. But and it was great fun to do and get a lot of thoughts together and take advantage of how much interesting work had been done, but to try to synthesize it in an argument that would do what I thought kind of needed to be done to see what role religion played in the work rather than what role the work played in Shakespeare's religion. It seems to me they sort of had it backwards.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm pleased with the reaction of the book. I mean, people, it's a short book and it was for lectures and it was written for a public audience. And I chose to keep some of the bad jokes. But when I read them over, they still make me smile. So I'm grateful to you for bringing that up. I like that book. What's interesting, I just thought of this as you raised this question. So all of my books except that book have been translated into Chinese,
Yeah.
uh, including On Color. Um, and they're wonderful translations. And I've talked with the translators in each case, and they've been so thoughtful and careful and really wonderful, and often have asked wonderful questions, sharpening my own thinking about something I had written. And I would say, is it unfair in a translation to make this better? I mean, there are parts of at least two of the Chinese translation of my books that I think are better than the English, because working with a translator, I was able to sharpen something that was a little murky. But the one book which they flat out said we can't get published is the religion book. They said that would actually cause, I mean, some just frisson we don't want to go
Yeah.
to with, because that ought to be approved.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
that's really one.
it's hard. I I think I'm right in Mandarin Chinese. I know I'm right in Japanese. There is no to be verb. All right, well, let's start there. And there may be political problems with Christianity in China, not so much in Japan. It's just that I was recently helping a student review a production of Hamlet, and the Japanese scriptwriter, using an exquisitely good translation in Japanese, dropped for his audience, for instance, when Laertes is bickering with the priest about being his what the maimed rights. That is, and that can go over the heads of modern Christian audiences too. But you have a large number of people in the crowd who understand the idea of consecrated ground and getting a Christian burial, whereas in Japan, there's just no point of reference there. Why would there be so much fuss over what piece of ground you put this person in?
And how do you translate to be or not to be?
Well, according to Professor Y at the University of Tokyo, in over 50 ways, he's collected translations.
Let
Uh,
me count the ways.
yeah, and also, well, it's just he's a brilliant. He's been on this series. He's brilliant. What each one brings up is a way of looking at that speech and that line, because it can be, it can be a death wish, of course, but it can also mean to be in Japanese, should I be doing what I'm doing or do something else, or, all kinds of variations from some
Is
brilliant people.
Which is wonderful. It's one of the great things about translation. There isn't a one-to-one correlation from one language to another for almost any word, or any word that is complex and interesting. And
Yeah,
the translation is always as much about loss as it is about gain and accessibility. I mean, you have to give some things up at every moment, because there isn't this one, maybe it's metrical, maybe it's just oral. There are things you have to abandon to make it intelligible. And so I've On Color is the book of mine that has been translated into most languages, and I've sort of loved working with translators in all of the books. And
yeah.
they're kind of magicians, it seems to me.
Well, I wanted
Find
to I wanted to get to this one too, because we did talk about color, but I wanted to get to this particular book. I I was, when I saw it, I said, well, because it's you, I'm gonna give this a go. And I was just so extraordinarily surprised at how much I was engaged. Of course, you're the writer. You're working. You collaborate, which is something else that I like about your career. You're not shy to collaborate, which I think we should do far more of in the humanities. But on the issue of color, immediately my university is Aoyama, uh, and it means blue mountain in Japanese. Ao is blue. Now our school colors are green, obviously green. And on the edges, I'm slightly blue-green colorblind. There've been board games that I've had trouble. Trivial Pursuits, one of them. I couldn't tell the blue, parts from the green. But anyhow, it's obviously green to me, our school colors. And I began asking around, and everybody looked at me. The signal, they don't call it a green light, they call it a blue light. And I started thinking, I said, are they seeing something I'm not seeing right here? Is it a difference in DNA or so forth? So immediately I was drawn with this idea of perception of color and the spectrums that you brought up. And of course, the one of the, I think, standout chapters is the indigo, the color you can't see, right? So there's just brilliant observations there on uh, how we might perceive. Yeah, is your blue my blue?
Right. And how would you know? I mean, how could we convey because you only have this language with these imprecise words that variously define color fields. In Japanese, obviously green and blue are very close. In Russian, there are two words for blue that are quite different. In Hungarian, there are two words that for red, which don't mark chromatic differences, but mark affective differences. There's kind of a good-natured, pleasant red, and there's kind of a scary, threatening red. But it's often the very same. You'd still, depending on the affect, you could name the same color with either word. And so language doesn't quite do it. And then there's that famous argument from Gladstone, because he'd been prime minister as well as a good classicist in Britain in the 19th century. But he decided that the Greeks couldn't see blue, that there was a defective part of their color vision, and that, I mean, it could not have been cured quite as quickly as he imagined. And his evidence for that was that Homer defines the sea as wine dark.
Mm-hmm.
And that for him was the evidence that, and never uses a word that you translate as blue. And and it seems to me the real thing that wine dark there is more about luster, I assume, than color. Maybe than chroma is the point. And that color has all these aspects. There's an intensity, saturation part. There's a kind of lustrous versus flat. There is this chromatic space that it marks out, but people see it differently. And what's amazing, there was this amazing experiment that sort of started mostly at Berkeley started sort of in the 50s and 60s, but a bunch of anthropologists started to go to islands mainly in the South Pacific, where there hadn't been an enormous amount of traffic and there wasn't a dominant white culture. And they would come with colored chips of various hues and shades and tones. And the question was just group these in whatever way you think, but that they're grouped into things that you would use the same word for what color they are. And a couple of interesting things happened. I mean, sometimes they could do it, but the groupings were very different than the groupings, say, you and I might do, or with your color blindness, you and I would have different ones anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple of them said, we don't know what you mean by color, because they didn't have an abstracted, independent idea of color apart from the places in the culture where you experience color. So they had a lot of words for pink and red, but it was the color that your teeth turn when you chew betel nuts, or the color the mountain is when the sun is 5 minutes above its rising point. So they had lots of color words, but they were all experiential. And then I started to think about that, and you think, well, I mean, there were words for color that were used in various ways, but they didn't standardize really until there was a sort of abstract and industrial sense of color. Until you had paint firms, they didn't, I mean, people had plenty of words for color, but anyone who made blue, it was slightly different from anyone else who made blue. It was only once you got to this industrialization of paint, of lipstick, that things formed. And, this so-called primitive sense is kind of truer in a way, that our abstracted, industrialized sense is a sort of diminished idea of color. And I delighted you mentioned this point about collaboration, but color is kind of the ultimate collaboration,
It
the
is, yes.
collaboration of mind and world in some way,
Yeah.
which was really part of my interest in the whole project.
Well, the book, along with other of your writings, but this book in particular is this. Uh, uh, well, we use the word viral now, and it's not a good word to use anymore. I would say inseminates, which might be a little bit risque, but other ideas. It gives the reader a chance, an opportunity to do free association in our own experience, and so that's what's so joyous about the read. And I can give just one quick example. I was sort of I got a little bit of a critique. We call them reader number two on an article you want to publish. The grumpy guy woke up or just saw the note on the note on the refrigerator that his wife left him. I don't know, but there's the grumpy reader number two, and it's all over me about the whole idea that in Romeo and Juliet, in the prologue, it's famous, civil brawls, and so. And there's another part where the civil orange, right, but it's associated with blood, I think, and I don't think of blood being an orange color, but
Right.
they talk about in Much Ado, there's a use of civil as a kind of reddish color that comes to your face, a blush or something, and I do think that they did associate the orange with blood, that or at least that type of orange.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there are oranges, and I don't know what orange came from Sevilla that they thought of as civil orange, and the pun is certainly there, and you're right about this.
That's right. The Sevilla. That's where, okay, there we go.
Where it comes from.
Yeah.
And that often is a deep red, and they're, blood orange, what we would call a blood orange in American English now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Light skin, but a deep red color. And I think that's right. I mean, I like your reader number two theory. Just there's always a grumpy reader number two.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you had that experience, but I think you are right about that. And and one of the things one of the things that was fun about writing books was just learning things, which is the real. I think writing a book because you know things is so much less fun than writing a book because you want to know things. And that I think is how I've always written books. But with that orange chapter in that book is, what were there oranges? Was there orange before there were oranges? And
Yeah.
weirdly, the answer is no. That there, the color word isn't orange until after oranges have come to Europe, when Portuguese merchants brought them from India.
Yeah. Well, it was that chapter that provoked my memory of
Yeah, no,
a grumpy reader. Yeah.
I got grumpy readers too. One of the things you said, which is interesting, is the associations. And I think the great pleasure for me of the color book, more than any other book I've ever written, I'd say now it's slowed down, but when the book came out in 2018, and then during COVID, everybody was bored, so people were reading. But I would get an email once a week from somebody. Nobody I knew, not a Shakespeare scholar. Sometimes from a painter, sometimes just from somebody. I read your book, and do you know? And then send me the name of 6 painters I had never heard of from Sweden or something. and it was wonderful. I mean, that is the reaction it provoked. I mean, and that was the spirit in which it was written. It wasn't, this is right, is this is interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you.
Mhm.
That's a different rhetoric in a way. And the freedom as a Shakespeare scholar, as a ardent general editor, there's always that piece of you who thinks, well, you're the one who's supposed to get this right. And it was kind of wonderfully liberating to say, well, one, I don't know what right would be, but it did produce this wonderful, gratifying response from people all over the world saying, the book, for a reason I can't even begin to understand, the book it was translated, I think, into Korean, Chinese, Italian, Russian, but Romanian. So I have two rather eager Romanian email friends now
Yeah.
who send me pictures of Romanian artists who they think I'll be interested in seeing, which I am. But what a lovely outcome of a book. Instead of someone writing, said, "Oh, I read your book and I thought chapter 3 was wrong." This has produced an entirely different kind of reaction.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, things are and this, I'm going back to what we said earlier a little bit. When I was in fifth grade, for our international audience, that's elementary school, the fifth level, we had science fairs. And I didn't see myself as ever being a scientist or anything, but I saw this picture in the book of a disc that had white and black sectioned. And they said, if you spin this disc quickly, it will be all the colors in the spectrum. And I thought, I can make that disc because I have to do this thing for the science fair. And I can make a disc out of cardboard and do the white and black and then lock it into my father's power drill, right? And I put that out there, and when you click the drill and it spun, you saw all the colors, right? And that's the only brilliant scientific moment I had as a student. But
There's
uh,
another career path for you.
I couldn't think of, you just get these ideas, you get one in a lifetime, it's a blessing. But that being an example of something that is what it isn't, and white and black are not those colors. Goya is not beautiful, or the selected paintings, yet they are, and the and there's something terrible about beauty uh, that I guess is something you're going to have to I don't know how you're going to structure and put any kind of borders on this, but I'm absolutely certain you will, and you will accomplish this wonderfully. Um, I think I've kept you almost through your supper time. I don't know how you New Yorkers, how early you
This has been a pleasure.
when we're in
This,
Spain, of course, you can't even approach a restaurant until 8:30 in the evening. But so I don't want to keep you from getting your nourishment. David, this is just absolutely wonderful to have you agree to come on this series. Our goal here during COVID, when we started, was to be able to recreate academic conversations. And let's not call them academic. Let's call them the conversations that we love in the hallways where we work and with people, and when we can get out and see them and have lunch with them, have drinks with them or whatnot. And we couldn't do that. And then I realized as we went along that we don't do this nearly enough. We should do this. Is what drew us, isn't it?
it's a lovely idea. When you asked me, I was thrilled. I now want to watch all of these. I think this is fabulous, and it is what we do, and it's why we do it. We never would have thought of it as something to do. I mean, you, like me, I assume, didn't even know this was a job. I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't have a narrative in my head of how university professors became university professors. I thought you throw magic beans at a window and a big, they grow on some vine. And this is what's wonderful. I thank you so much. I really am grateful. And anytime you want to do this, I'm happy to do it.
Oh, well, I have you and you're in a good mood. I want to make sure that you will come back when Rembrandt and Shakespeare, or Shakespeare and Rembrandt, and the and problem, when that comes out, absolutely. I want to have you back if we're still in existence. We have to go hat in hand along with everybody else and make sure the funding agencies out there. I think we're going to have a little bit of a run here still. So if I may ask you to stay a bit after we finish recording, just to debrief a moment, and then I'll let you get on about your life. And once again, thank you so much, David.